This video is sponsored by Brilliant. Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Today I wanted to address a kind of weird controversy, one that's been popping up in my comment section for years and in the greater music theory discourse for much longer than that. It's a question that cuts to the core of our traditional understanding of harmony, one that forces us to re-examine everything we thought we knew. And that question is, what's the deal with 3 minor? Or to put it more precisely, what is 3 minor's function? That's right, we're talking about functional harmony again. Traditionally, we sort the chords of the major scale into 3 main functions, or jobs. There's tonic function, which provides a sense of rest, subdominant function, which adds instability to take you away, and dominant function, which points you back home. For the most part, we pretty much all agree on which chords do which jobs. The 1 chord is tonic, the 5 is dominant, and so on. But the 3 minor is a bit trickier. If you've watched our previous videos, you may have heard me say that it's tonic, but whenever I do, I get a bunch of people insisting it's actually dominant. So which is it? Well, let's start with the history. Functional harmony as a model is generally attributed to the 19th century German theorist Hugo Riemann. Riemann's approach was based on what are called primary triads, that is the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord. He believed that each of these primary triads had its own function, so the 1 chord was tonic, the 4 chord was subdominant, and the 5 chord was dominant. For the rest of the chords though, we need to talk about inversions. An inversion is just when the lowest note of the chord isn't actually its root, so for instance we could take this E minor and play it with a G in the bass. This puts it in what's called first inversion, and if we do that, it actually sounds a lot like a G chord, just with an E instead of a D. Riemann takes this a step further, arguing that in the key of G major, E minor actually is a kind of G chord, which means it gets the same function. We can repeat this for our other major triads to give each one its own little shadow, a minor chord whose root is a third below it that shares the same function, so 6 minor joins the 1 chord in tonic, 2 minor joins the 4 chord in subdominant, and 3 minor joins the 5 chord in dominant. That gives us 6 of our functions, but you may have noticed that this model doesn't tell us what the 7 diminished chord does, and that's because Riemann doesn't really view it as a chord at all. Not that you can't play it, of course, but he argued that if you did, what you were really playing was an incomplete voicing of the 5 dominant 7 chord, not a unique harmonic object, and since it's the same chord, it should have the same function, so 7 diminished is dominant as well. Anyway, this all means that originally 3 minor was a dominant function chord, but modern music doesn't really use inversions in the same way, so in that context, many musicians, myself included, argue that viewing the 3 chord as dominant is kinda misleading. Much like the 7 diminished can be viewed as an incomplete voicing of 5 dominant 7, I tend to think that 3 minor is best viewed as an incomplete voicing of 1 major 7, which means it shares the function of the 1 chord, making it tonic. But right now, it's just my word against Riemann's, so let's dive a bit deeper and look at how chord functions actually work. In my experience, the best way to understand them is to look for certain characteristic notes that tell us how the chords want to behave. For instance, dominant function is defined by a note called the leading tone. This is the 7th note of the scale, and it sits a half step below the root, which gives it a really strong pull upward. This pull is where dominant function gets its sense of directionality from, so it makes sense that it defines the function. Finding the characteristic note for tonic function, though, is a bit harder. It's tempting to assume that tonic function is defined by the root of the scale. It's the most melodically stable point, so it would make a good foundation for our most stable function. And we do see that root in 1 major and 6 minor, which are both tonic, but we also see it in 4 major, which is very much not tonic. That's because it also contains subdominant function's characteristic note, the 4, but here's the thing, subdominant function is kinda the weakest of the chord functions. It's basically just a harmonic gap filler, so if the root of the scale actually is the characteristic note of tonic function, it seems strange to me that it could be so thoroughly overpowered by the mere presence of the 4th. But if it's not the root, what is it? Well, in order to answer that, we need to take a quick detour and look a bit closer at how subdominant function works. Again, its characteristic note is the 4th, which is important because it's a half step above the 3rd. The 3rd of the scale is what's called the primary modal note, which means it's the thing that tells us whether we're playing in major or minor, and using the 4th instead means we don't get that information. The lack of the 3rd is what destabilizes a subdominant chord, so we can infer that the presence of the 3rd is what stabilizes a tonic chord. So if dominant function is defined by the leading tone and tonic function by the primary modal note, then we can start to see the problem of 3 minor. It has both. It's not the only triad with 2 characteristic notes. 7 diminished has the 7th and the 4th, but as we mentioned, subdominant function is weak, so dominant clearly wins out. But in the case of 3 minor, it's not quite so obvious. Which note is stronger? Which function wins? Well, we've looked at how functions happened and how they work, and we're no closer to an answer. Fortunately, we have one test left. Let's look at how functions functions are used. One thing that functional harmony is good for is chord substitutions. That is, if two chords share the same function, we can easily swap one for the other without really changing the harmony. Take the classic 1-5-1 progression, for instance. We can replace the 5 chord with 7 diminished, or the 1 chord with 6 minor, and it still feels largely the same. It's a slightly different color, but we still get a strong resolution, and that's what the progression is all about. This means that if 3 minor was dominant, we could swap it in over the 5 chord and get the same effect, so let's try it. Yeah, that doesn't really work. And there's a good reason why. Traditionally, motion between chords a third apart is considered weak because so few of the notes actually change, and when you're trying to get a good resolution, weak is not a word you want to hear. So there you have it. 3 minor can't really resolve to 1, so it's not a good dominant chord, but before we wrap up, just to prove that I'm right, let's try substituting it for the 1 chord instead. Oh. Whoops, okay, that doesn't work very well either, because again, we're moving by thirds. The leading tone doesn't even move, so we don't get that nice directional resolution we're looking for. That's not to say this progression doesn't sound good, by the way. I actually like it a lot, but it doesn't sound resolved, which means we don't really have a tonic function chord either. So it can't resolve, and it can't be resolved too, which honestly makes it seem like it might be subdominant, but I'm not going down that particular rabbit hole right now. Or, okay, fine, real quick, when you're looking outside the major scale, I do think it's often useful to view subdominant as less of a defined function and more of a catch-all category for any chord that doesn't fit into either of the other two, but in major this stuff has been so thoroughly codified through both theory and practice that I think trying to extend subdominant like that does more harm than good. But if 3 minor isn't tonic, it isn't dominant, and it certainly isn't subdominant, then what is it? Well, the simple answer is that it's the least commonly used chord in major scale progressions, rivaled only by 7 diminished, which, as Riemann points out, is only arguably its own chord in the first place. But not using it isn't an answer, it's just ducking the question, so when we do use 3 minor, how should we actually think about it? Well, I like to think of it as tonic, but a special kind of tonic. It can't create rest, but it can extend it. Like, take this famous progression. Here we start with 1 major and 6 minor, both of which are tonic. In this case though, 6 minor's job isn't to establish tonic function, it's to let us stay there longer while introducing a new chord so the harmony doesn't get stale. And for that purpose, we can substitute 3 minor just fine. It can also sort of act as a dominant extension if we play it right after the 5, because the dominant nature of the previous chord helps the leading tone stand out more, driving the resolution a little bit harder. In the end though, I think the question is the answer. The 3 minor is ambiguous because it exploits an edge case in the functional harmony model, and no amount of debate will change the fact that the leading tone and the primary modal note are at war inside the chord. We can't just arbitrarily decide that one function wins out over the other, we have to look at the context of its use to decide which role it's fulfilling in that particular instance. Normally, in my experience, that's tonic, but ultimately it's a gray area, and gray areas are where music theorists get to have the most fun. Speaking of fun, let's talk about this video's sponsor, Brilliant. If you've got 5 minutes a day, why not spend it learning math and science with Brilliant's daily problems? These are short little puzzles designed to teach you new concepts like how the ancients track time or how solar sails work. Each problem provides you with the necessary context to solve it, and if you like the problem and want to learn more, each one is related to a whole problem-solving course that explores the same concept in greater detail. It's really helpful and a lot of fun, so if you want to develop your skills or just learn more about Brilliant, you can go to brilliant.org/12tone and sign up for free. Plus, the first 200 people to click that link will get 20% off their already cheap annual premium subscription, so you can view all the daily problems in the archives and unlock all the courses. And hey, thanks for watching, and thanks to our Patreon patrons for supporting us and making these videos possible. If you want to help out and get some sweet perks like sneak peeks of upcoming episodes, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.